Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, just say the magic word as I review the DC Comics adaptation, Shazam!
14-year-old Billy Batson, played by Asher Angel, still searching for his mother, is sent to live with Victor and Rosa Vasquez, played by Cooper Andrews and Martin Milans, and their extended foster family. Billy is chosen by the wizard Shazam, played by Jamon Hunsu, to be his successor, bestowing upon him incredible powers when he calls the wizard's name, turning him into an adult superhero, played by Zachary Levy. As Billy comes to grips with his new powers with the aid of his disabled foster brother and superhero-obsessive Freddy, played by Jack Dylan Grazer, he must also face off against Dr. Thaddeus Savannah, played by Mark Strong, who has acquired the command of the 7 deadly sins.
The character of Shazam has a rather complicated history. Originally created under the name Captain Marvel for Fawcett Comics in 1939, which actually gets a name check in this movie as the name of the school the kids go to, the character was enormously popular in the 1940s, outselling even Superman, the character that he's most often compared to, which may make it understandable why DC actually sued Fawcett for copyright infringement, claiming that Captain Marvel was too similar to Superman, which led to Captain Marvel being discontinued in the early 1950s. In the 70s, DC acquired the rights to Captain Marvel, however by that point, Marvel Comics had themselves created their own character called Captain Marvel in the 1960s, which led to a trademark dispute, so DC had to market their own Captain Marvel under the name of Shazam, which officially became the character's name in 2011. Got all that? Good. Whew! I think it's a little bit of a funny coincidence, in fact, that the film adaptations of Captain Marvel and Shazam have opened just weeks away from each other. That's one of those kind of weird cosmic coincidences. I do have to admit that the development of this movie is similarly laboured. This has been in development at New Line Cinema for the best part of 15 years. And for the longest time, Dwayne Johnson was attached to this movie. He was going to play the supervillain Black Adam, not Shazam. But the way that this is eventually figured out is that Shazam is getting his own movie, and so is Black Adam, which is presumably going to star Dwayne Johnson in the future. But you can still see remnants of this development because Dwayne Johnson is actually credited as an executive producer on this movie. Shazam, as it finally arrives on screen, is directed by David F. Sandberg, who up until this point has directed horror movies including Lights Out and Annabelle Creation. This is his first non-horror movie, and it comes at a time when, of course, the DC Universe is still trying to reconfigure itself post-Justice League. But this and Aquaman have very much ushered in a much lighter tone to the universe, and I think the response to Aquaman and the early responses to this have shown that audiences actually quite like superhero movies in this kind of style. Of course, the next DC film is dipping back into darker territory with the Joaquin Phoenix one-shot of Joker, but for now, we have Shazam, and I do have to admit, I find it very hard to believe that at any point they were creating a dark and gritty version of this character, because there's a lot of silliness to this character, which this film embraces. I didn't really have a lot of expectations for this movie, but I actually had a lot of fun with this. I really enjoyed myself with Shazam. The reason why Shazam feels so fresh and stands out in the current superhero landscape is that honestly, for much of the running time, it doesn't feel like one, because that's not the model. The model is more that of the high concept comedy, so you think of the likes of the classic Tom Hanks vehicle Big, which is such an obvious inspiration they even directly reference it at one point. But if I did have to compare this to a superhero movie, it would be the Jim Carrey flick, The Mask, and when I make points of reference like that, you can understand why I consider this movie to be a bit of a throwback, and I mean that in the nicest possible terms. I think that superhero movies, as we stand right now, are very much invested in building worlds and building universes, and sometimes that can bog them down and make them inaccessible. Shazam doesn't really do a lot of that. It does it a little bit, they are trying to connect it to the wider DC universe, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but honestly, for the most part, it's much more simplified and streamlined. It works, as a standalone adventure, and that very much works in its favour, especially because the broad appeal of the character is wish fulfillment. A boy not just gets turned into a man, he gets turned into a superhero, and all the abilities that come with it. So instead of the younger version of Tom Hanks going up to the Zoltar machine, we have Billy being transported to the wizard Shazam and getting all the powers. And of course, what 14-year-old kid wouldn't want superpowers? There's a really infectious enthusiasm to the movie, and a big part of that is the performance of Zachary Levy as Shazam. Levy is really perfectly cast here. I think that when you look at him, he has that sort of matinee idol appearance. He's got this kind of chiseled good looks, which are comically amplified by his padded out suit, but yet he's got this kind of goofy, sort of awkward demeanour, which matches the fact that there's a disconnect between the mind inside the body, essentially. That's what Tom Hanks' mind in Big so well, that sort of innocence that's really kind of disarming when seen in a much older person, and it's really uncharacteristic, and the film minds a lot of that sort of disconnect for its jokes, as well it should. A lot of the funniest moments in this movie is simply Billy going around in his new body and trying to explore all the things that he simply can't do because he's not old enough, be it going into a grocery store and buying your finest beer and looking awfully shifty about it the whole time, or ending up in strip bars or things like that. Levy's especially good in his earlier scenes where he plays Billy having just recently acquired his powers and honestly still trying to work out what they even are, and he stumbles upon them with a mix of wide-eyed wonder and astonishment that's great for getting laughs, but also reiterates how likeable he is as a performer. Even when the character's being a little bit selfish and a bit petulant at times, Levy is always charming and disarming. Of course, it also helps the child actors they cast are really terrific. Asher Angel as Billy and Jack Dylan Grazer as Freddy work really well together. In fact, Grazer, who was recently seen in it, he is fantastic, and he really works well with both Angel and Levy, which helps sell them as both being the same character. And Freddy is really the embodiment of the comic book fan. He's the kid that has read all the comic books and asks, like he does in the earliest scenes of this movie, what would your superpower be? And I guess in Billy's case, the answer would be all of them. And that's one of the parts of Shazam that's so appealing, is that in a lot of ways it functions on ground level. It's set in a world where, yeah, superheroes exist, but they're a bit of a distant, far-flung possibility. They're not really something that's in an everyday world like this. And so suddenly you have a superhero being thrust in this environment, and that's where another part of the humour lies. It's not just the disconnect between body and mind, it's also in terms of just his situational environments. You know, a lot of the settings in Shazam are not typically places you would see superheroes be in. And that alone, I think, makes it really something unique, I think, among very many superhero films, which are often at the same sort of heightened fantastical level as the superheroes, when honestly, for a lot of Shazam's first act, it plays it fairly realistic. There's this kind of, you know, sort of fantastic realism at play a lot of the time in Shazam. The film has a lot of honest-to-goodness sincerity about it. Like Billy himself, it feels pure of heart. This can be especially seen in the moments with the Foster family, the Vasquezes. Those scenes are really cute, and family is a core theme of this film, and it's a concept that Billy has to wrap his head around, being an orphan for so long. He's had to learn to fend for himself, and so he's very street smart. He knows how to take care of himself, but he's very isolated. He's done that deliberately because he's hoping to reconnect with his birth mother, and he hopes that the day that he does that, everything will be right again. So when he's first introduced to his new foster family, he's shielding himself. He's deliberately avoiding making connections and participating in their rituals. And over the course of the film, even as he amasses this enormous wealth of powers at his disposal, he realises that he cannot function simply by himself. Even with those, he needs allies by his side, and he learns to embrace this new family, which I think is really sweetly done across the course of the film. And that sweetness works in its favour when it's working as a spoof of the superhero genre, because it always feels good-natured. There's a lot of kind of schoolboy humour of like, oh, I don't know how to pee in this suit, and he's got to transform in and out of it. That joke becomes like a running gag all throughout this movie, and generally that's the sort of tone a lot of the humour takes. It's those kind of cracks, but it's never really kind of mean-spirited. You compare it to something like Deadpool, which would be the closest point of comparison. Sometimes that can be really quite scathing, and sometimes that can be a little bit on the mean-spirited side. Shazam never does that, and that really helps, I think. And the filmmakers are very much aware that, yeah, the character is a little bit silly. We know that, but we're having fun with it, and we're hoping that you are as well. I mentioned earlier that this does try to connect to the wider DC cinematic universe, which is of course inevitable, but I do have mixed feelings about that, because even though of course DC is doing a course correction with its latest films, it just felt really weird to me to have a film like this reference the events of something like, say, Batman v Superman as occurring within the same world. You see newspaper clippings, there are references to the characters, which of course makes sense because they're obviously trying to build up to a movie where perhaps they have Shazam and Superman in the same film together, and yet, at the same time, those movies are poles apart from each other, to the point where I would actually say that Shazam is the antithesis of something like Batman v Superman, which was very dark, almost borderline nihilistic in terms of its tone, and was very much about disharmony and infighting, whereas Shazam is all about positivity. When you try to marry those two things together and constantly keep reminding us about it, there are frequent reminders all across this movie about where its place is in the DC cinematic universe. That gets a little bit distracting at times. You just find yourself going, this doesn't really feel like the same world in the same kind of ways. Of course, the problem with trying to adjust the tone midway through establishing a universe, especially one that has had so many changes and conflicts as the DC cinematic universe has had creatively so far. In terms of more serious problems, I wasn't really much of a fan of Mark Strong's Dr. Sivana. Not because I dislike Mark Strong, I think he's a really great actor and he's played a lot of fantastic villain roles in the past. Hell, he's one of the few redeeming aspects of Green Lantern, for crying out loud, but he's not given very much to do here. He's pretty much just an out-and-out bad guy and very one-dimensional with not a lot of nuance to him, which is disappointing given the setup for that character. The whole opening sequence of this movie is focused around him as a boy being summoned by the wizard for the test, and he's rejected like he's been his entire life by the rest of his family, which only confirms the sort of negativity and self-hatred he holds within him that drives him for the rest of his life to acquire the power of the 7 deadly sins. And you would have thought, given they spend a lot of time setting up this sort of mirroring between him and Shazam, that they'd work with that a bit more, but honestly, they don't. And in terms of tone, whenever the 7 deadly sins are around, it does feel like it's a little bit too intense for what is otherwise a fairly light film. I can understand adding a bit of darkness to this movie, otherwise it's a little bit frivolous. But Sandberg's horror background definitely shines through whenever those characters are around, and I like the design of the 7 deadly sins, as grotesque as they are. Disappointingly, we don't actually get to see them in a lot of detail a lot of the time, but I just think in general that's just a little bit too much for what is ostensibly a family film. It really could have worked for young audiences if they maybe toned that back a bit, in my opinion. I do have to say the boardroom scene is a cliche that in comic book movies I really wished had died. I don't know why that suddenly had sprung back in this movie. Of course, you think of the likes of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man or Tim Story's Fantastic Four, where they all have villains in corporate board meetings. That's a weird trope that just keeps coming back in these movies. I don't know why that keeps occurring, but it just adds to the feeling of a character that is overall generic and not especially memorable. The other major problem for me is the running time. At 130 minutes, Shazam is wildly overlong. This is another running problem with the DC films of late, in that Aquaman at 2 hours and 20 minutes was again miles too long. This here feels a little bit overstretched at over 2 hours because it does not need to be. This could have easily had about 15 to 20 minutes taken out of it, and it would have been a much tighter experience. There is certain scenes in this film that feel like they maybe drag on a little bit too long. This is especially true of the opening pre-title sequence setting up the origin of Dr. Sivana, but also the climax. The climax of this movie goes on for about half an hour, it feels like. It feels like there's about 3 different climaxes, and some great things happen towards the end of this movie, don't get me wrong, but it does feel like it's overextended to a certain extent. Like, yes, the story has reached its conclusion. Conclude! The only other gripe is the CGI work, which occasionally can be inconsistent. Shazam was made for a much smaller budget than most other superhero films, as you would expect, because it's on a much smaller scale, and sometimes that does manifest itself in the effects work, which can be a little bit iffy at points. This is especially true when Shazam has to be replaced by a CGI double. The CGI version of Zachary Levy looks a little bit rubbery, especially when they do some very tight close-ups on him and they try to do some impossible camera moves that result in some really kind of strange body movements at points. It's only a couple of select moments here and there, but it is a reminder that this movie is made for a much smaller budget than most other competing superhero films. Overall though, I had a really good time with Shazam. I think it'll work for both superhero fans, but also those just looking for a good comedy. It hits both those markers pretty effectively, and in terms of the DC cinematic universe so far, it sits pretty near the top, in large part because it embraces what it is. That's why Aquaman and Wonder Woman before it work so well, and in terms of ranking them, it's pretty close with Wonder Woman, in my opinion. Both of them have their faults. They're not perfect movies, but I would consider them to be very good. Not great just yet. I don't think the DC Cinematic Universe has put out a truly great movie yet, but I think it's very much capable of doing so in the future, because this is a really encouraging step. More like this, please.
Shazam is a very enjoyable superhero adventure that very much has its tongue firmly planted in its cheek, making it very easy to like. It actually plays more like a throwback high-concept comedy for much of the running time, like a beefed-up version of Big, and the film manages to be both sweetly sincere while still getting away with poking fun at the tropes of superhero films in a good-natured way. As a movie, this is the biggest departure yet from the DC universe, adding a welcome lightness and innocence, although that does mean the film's frequent reminders that it takes place in the same universe as Batman v Superman are rather jarring, especially for what is otherwise a standalone. Mark Strong's villain is unfortunately a little on the generic side, with the 7 deadly sins probably being a little too intense for the family film this clearly could be, and the movie does suffer from its excessive 130-minute length, including an overextended climax, and some of the effects are inconsistent. Nevertheless, this is one of the strongest showings of the DC universe to date, capable of thunderous laughter at points.
If you like this review, then just say the word Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.